It was early November when my friends and I, Kate, Sarah, and I, rented a remote cabin deep in the woods. The photos online made it look cozy, a perfect escape from the chaos of city life. When we arrived, however, the cabin seemed far older than we expected. The paint was peeling, the porch creaked under our weight, and the woods surrounding it felt unnaturally quiet. The first night, everything seemed fine. We laughed, cooked dinner, and played cards by the fireplace. But as the hours passed and the fire burned low, the silence outside became oppressive. Around midnight, we heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic tapping on the window. Kate laughed nervously. "Probably a branch," she said, but Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. The tapping continued, soft but deliberate, moving from one window to the next. Sarah finally mustered the courage to peek through the curtains. She gasped and stumbled back, pale as a ghost. "There's a woman," she whispered. "She's just standing there." We all rushed to the window, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and the trees. "You're imagining things," Kate said, though her voice wavered. The next morning, we found footprints circling the cabin. They were small, almost childlike, but the way they twisted and turned around the windows was unsettling. We decided to stay. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. Where could we go? The second night, the tapping returned, louder this time. We ignored it until the doorknob rattled. "Let me in," a woman's voice croaked. It was thin, wheezy, and far too close. We screamed as the door shook violently, the old wood groaning under the force. When morning came, the footprints were gone, and so was any sign of the mysterious woman. But that night, I woke up to see her face pressed against the window, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She whispered, "Let me in," over and over until I fainted. We left the next day, abandoning everything we brought. Weeks later, I found a note tucked into my jacket pocket. In crude handwriting, it read, "I'll see you again." It was a cold November evening when my brother and I decided to spend a weekend at an old family cabin. The place hadn't been used in years, and the forest surrounding it had grown wild and overgrown. We arrived just before sunset, the golden light casting long shadows through the trees. The first day was uneventful. We cleaned the cabin, set up our supplies, and built a fire to ward off the chill. But as night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and something that sounded like heavy breathing. "Probably just animals," my brother said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the window. The second night, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the woods, following the sounds. About 100 yards from the cabin, we found a clearing. In the center was a makeshift camp, an old tent, a fire pit filled with ashes, and a wooden crate filled with rusted tools. Scattered around were bones. Animal bones, we hoped. "Let's get out of here," I said. But before we could move, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his clothes filthy and torn. His eyes gleamed with a wild, unsettling intensity. "This is my home," he growled, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." We stumbled back, muttering apologies, but he followed us, his movements slow and deliberate. "You came here to die, didn't you?" he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. We ran, his laughter echoing behind us. Back at the cabin, we locked the doors and windows, but the laughter continued, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate drag of something sharp against the walls. We left at dawn, abandoning our car when we saw it had been gutted. The man watched us from the tree line, his grin wide, his hands stained with something dark. We never spoke of that weekend again. I can still feel the chill of that weekend, no matter how hard I try to forget it. It was late November, and my friends, Mike, Sarah, and I, had rented this old cabin in the middle of nowhere. We thought it would be the perfect escape. It seemed charming at first, cozy even, but there was one thing that stood out from the moment we arrived. The basement door. It was locked, not just with a simple latch, but wrapped in thick, rusted chains. The padlock looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The owner handed us the keys and pointed to the door with a stern expression. "Don't open it," he said. "It's not safe." Mike laughed, brushing it off as some local superstition. "What's down there? Rats?" he joked. The owner didn't respond. He just stared at us for a moment, then walked away without another word. The first night passed quietly. We cooked dinner, played cards, and had a few drinks by the fire. But that door, it was always there, in the corner of my eye, like it was watching us. By the second night, the curiosity was unbearable. Mike was the first to bring it up. "Come on," he said, pouring himself another drink. "Don't you want to know what's down there? It's probably just junk." Sarah shook her head. "We were told not to open it." "Why mess with it?" "Because they told us not to," Mike said, grinning. "That's the fun part." I should have stopped him. I should have insisted we leave it alone. But instead, I stood there, watching as he grabbed a crowbar and started prying at the chains. It took hours. Every groan of the chains, every creak of the door sent shivers down my spine. Finally, with one last heave, the padlock snapped. The door swung open, and the smell hit us instantly. It was foul, like something long dead and rotting. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the basement itself didn't want us there. "Let's just close it back up," Sarah whispered. But Mike was already halfway down the stairs. "Relax," he called over his shoulder. "It's just a basement." I wish he'd been right. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dirt-covered room. In the center was a chair, and on the chair sat a doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked, its mouth crudely stitched shut with black thread. Its eyes were black buttons, shiny and wet-looking, and they seemed to follow us wherever we moved. "This is messed up," I muttered, backing toward the stairs. Before anyone could respond, the basement door slammed shut above us. The sound echoed in the small space, and we all jumped. Then the light bulb flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the room. It went out completely, plunging us into darkness. At first, it was silent. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Then they grew louder, circling us, coming from every corner of the room. "Get out," they said. "You don't belong here." We ran to the stairs, banging on the door, screaming for help. It wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into laughter, deep and guttural, and I felt something brush against my arm. Cold, clammy, and unmistakably real. "Did you feel that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Yes," Sarah said, barely able to speak. "It's touching me." Mike swung the crowbar blindly into the dark, yelling for whatever it was to stay back. But the laughter only grew louder, closer. Then, with a sickening thud, the doll fell off the chair. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, we managed to break the door down and scramble into the living room. But Sarah wasn't with us. We called her name, but all we could hear was her scream echoing from the basement. When we went back, the room was empty. The doll was back on the chair, its stitched mouth twisted into a crooked smile. There was a fresh red stain on its dress. We left that night, abandoning everything we'd brought with us. A year later, we heard the cabin had burned to the ground. No one knew how the fire started, but locals say you can still hear screams coming from the woods. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear whispers. "Get out," they say. "You don't belong here."